Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Convalescent plasma therapy, CPT, is being trialed around the world as a possible treatment for the new coronavirus. But when it comes to this therapy, it seems like we are still navigating uncharted waters. What more needs to be known in order to determine its efficacy? Let's talk about that and more. Joining us for this discussion today is Prof. Emily Smith, who is an epidemiologist and an assistant professor at the George Washington University. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Also joining us today is Dr. Eileen McBride, who's a hematologist and is a senior attending physician in hematology and the medical director of transfusion medicine at the Sidra Medicine in Doha. She joins us from Doha. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Eileen McBride, before we really get to the merits and demerits of this therapy, could you just take us through what it really entails? What is CPT?
So it involves a donor giving their plasma. And so an individual who's been infected with coronavirus in this case, whose immune system has recognized the virus and made an antibody, which is a protein. They then, once they're recovered from the infection, would give their plasma. That can be done, the image that you're showing is a plasma donation. And the plasma contains that protein antibody. And then that plasma is given to patients who are acutely ill, and the antibody then serves as a sort of passive immune system for the recipient to go ahead and attack the coronavirus.
Right. Dr. McBride, before we get to exactly how efficient this is and what information do we know about it as of yet, what do we know about the antibodies that are developed after a person recovers from COVID-19? Because it seems like the information is still evolving. We really don't know who produces how many antibodies. Do everyone produce antibodies after they recover? What do we know about that as of yet?
So that's a great question. Everyone's immune system is a little bit different. And so every human who makes antibodies will have slight differences. The antibodies that are produced can be categorized as a couple of different ways. Some antibodies effectively completely neutralize the virus, and those are thought to be the most effective type of antibodies. The tests that we use to measure the antibodies are also different, and so you can see an antibody there, but it may not be as effective because our immune system sees the virus and sees different parts of the virus, and some antibodies may be more effective than others. And again, as I was saying, everyone is different and everyone's immune system is different. So some people produce very large numbers of antibodies and other people produce smaller amounts of antibodies. That may have to do with their immune system. It may also have to do with the severity of the infection that they have recovered from. And so those questions are still outstanding. Exactly what antibodies we should be measuring, what dose of antibody is the most important, those questions are still out there.
Right. Stay with me, Dr. McBride, and jump to Professor Emily Smith and talk to her about how CPT is being weighed in as a possible way to tackle COVID-19 across the world. What do we know about the trials going on so far?
Convalescent plasma has been used to treat serious infections for over 100 years. And so starting off, we know more about it in general than some other treatments. So starting, we feel optimistic. But what has been done so far? First, safety has been rigorously tested. So we've seen results in the last week or so from Mayo Clinic involving 1,500 enrolled patients looking at the safety. And this study confirms that there are no unexpected adverse reactions or side effects that have happened among those patients who have gotten convalescent plasma. The other type of work, of course, is to see if it's effective at actually preventing or stopping severe disease. And we had a week or so ago a publication by Li and colleagues from China that was published in JAMA, a leading medical journal, showing that convalescent plasma, again, is safe and the study also shows a general trend towards its efficacy, but it also shows some interesting things, like the patients in this study were older. They were 70 years old on average, and they had more than 30 days pass on average from when they first had symptoms to when they got convalescent plasma. And so it really was not effective among patients who were already on a ventilator or had this life-threatening disease. And so that's consistent with the general knowledge that this treatment won't be effective for everyone. And so we have a lot more work to do to understand exactly who it will be effective for and when is the right time to give this treatment.
Right, Professor Emily Smith, as you say, that a lot more work that needs to be done before we exactly are able to determine the efficacy of this treatment. What does that work entail, just so the general audience understands what goes into determining whether this trial is gaining the desired results?
Yeah, so the gold standard of evidence, what we like to see are randomized control trials. This means patients are randomly selected to get the plasma therapy versus not get the therapy. And then we compare their outcomes. And the important thing here, you can imagine as was mentioned earlier, that each person has different antibodies or produces a different level of antibodies. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in these good clinical trials is to standardize the treatment to make sure that the same types of antibodies and the same level of antibodies are in the plasma that we're giving in these studies. So again, we can understand better what's in the treatment, right? It's a little different than just a medicine where we know exactly the level of it in every treatment. And so doctors are working to standardize what that treatment is and to give it the gold standard test of comparing the convalescent plasma to a placebo.
Right. Dr. Eileen McBride, similar point. Do you feel like there is enough caution exercised by governments when we're hearing about these treatments rolling in as possible, if not solutions, but possible ways to tackle COVID-19? Is there enough caution? Because we know processes are being accelerated all across the world, but are they going towards a standard that can maintain safety?
As Professor Smith has said, this has been used in many instances for many infections for about 100 years. So it was used in the Spanish flu in 1918. It was used in the MERS epidemic. It was used in Ebola. So I think we're using historical data for similar use. And exactly as was said, we really don't have the final data as to whether it's effective and in whom it's effective and when it will be effective in patients with COVID-19. So the safety piece of things seems to have a lot of history behind it. We use plasma for all sorts of reasons, and giving the plasma for COVID does not take away the safety requirements for blood donors in general. And so the big question is whether you can transmit the virus through the donation, and that seems to have been shown not to be the case, or certainly not to provide serious disease once the patient has cleared the infection. So I think from a safety perspective, I think everything does have to be quicker because of the current state of affairs. But using the data that we do have, and there are dozens of studies ongoing, and I certainly would encourage the use of patients participating in studies and using the voluntary donation methods as opposed to any kind of paid for donations, which I would definitely discourage.
Right. Dr. Eileen McBride, I'll put this question to you, and then I'm going to take it to Professor Emily Smith as well. Where does the role of antibody testing play in the grand scheme of things, especially when governments and economies want to move towards reopening? As you say, there's so much we still don't know about it, but for a very long time, or at least till recently, antibody testing was seen as a crucial step in trying to move forward. What are some of your thoughts on that?
So great question. I wish I had a crystal ball and knew the answer to that. Unfortunately, the antibody tests, which is not my area of expertise, but the type of antibody tests from a microbiology perspective, we don't have that completely worked out. I think we also don't quite know whether people can get reinfected if they have antibodies. Does that antibody titer or antibody level wane with time and put the person at risk again? We don't have the answers to that. I think that we need more information as we go forward. I definitely think it's promising that if a patient has had exposure, has developed antibodies, to think that there is some element of protection, again, based on historical and other infectious diseases, one would think so. We just don't have all the answers just yet for COVID.
Right. Professor Smith, do you share that same view with Dr. McBride?
Yes, I would say that antibody tests are useful for research, and governments can use them for decision making to understand how much of a given population has been infected. And I know some excellent researchers at Aga Khan University in Karachi are doing just that. But for individual people, an antibody test should not be used to make personal health decisions. Everyone should continue to practice good public health guidance and follow this social distancing, wearing masks, etc., regardless of what an antibody test says, because as Dr. McBride said, we don't exactly understand how much the antibodies protect you.
Professor Emily Smith, that's such an point you make, and I would love for you to expand on it a little more, especially for all those individuals who are recovering from COVID-19, who have gotten their antibody tests done. They feel like they're solid plasma donors. What do they need to keep in mind going forward? Just expand on that a little more.
Absolutely. Even if you have had COVID-19, even if you have an antibody test that suggests you had COVID-19, you should still continue to maintain this physical distance, to avoid large gatherings, to wear a mask in public, to wash your hands often, because for right now, we don't know if these antibodies or this previous infection really keeps you safe or keeps other people safe. And so right now, we all have to continue to take these precautions.
Right. Dr. Eileen McBride, just one last question from you before I let you off. Now, an important element of the research that is coming out is the blood clotting that is involved during a person who has contracted COVID-19, how the body reacts to it. What more do we know about this aspect?
Wow. So, there's been a lot going around about this, and it's thought to be a marked inflammation response, and part of inflammation includes proteins in the blood that contribute to blood clotting. It's not completely understood why this particular virus is causing a bit of a skew in that balance of bleeding and clotting and skewing things towards the clotting. There's an awful lot of work being done on that, but it really is thought to be the body's inflammatory reaction and tilting the balance.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. McBride, for joining us from Doha and talking to us. Professor Emily Smith, going back to you now, 10.5 million people around the world have been infected with this virus, and we don't see the wave stopping anytime soon. Now, moving on from this, what do you think governments need to keep in mind in terms of determining how to tackle it, the mistakes they can learn from since December?
It's a great question. There are governments who have done a good job at this, and we continue to recommend the same things: test, trace, isolate. So this means we need clear diagnostic testing that's available to everyone. We need a good test and trace system. So every time a COVID case is detected, we need to very quickly find all of their contacts and ask them to isolate as well. And so the governments, some governments have this set up well. In the US, we don't have it set up well, but it's not too late. And same for any government. It's not too late to get these systems in place. And so that's from a government perspective. From an individual perspective, it means that we are in for a long haul of continuing to do these things like maintain social distance, avoid large gatherings, washing your hands. So I think it's important for us to think about what's the new normal and how can we live life to the fullest while still practicing these good public health practices.
Right. It's being reiterated time and time again that the most important tool we have throughout all of this is human behavior, how humans react during the situation. As you mentioned, social distancing, but we're also seeing that patience is wearing thin. What type of engagement is needed with the public by governments in order to continuously maintain that sort of level of care and safety?
Hard for individual people to continue to do this. And also, in my opinion, it's not fair to rely only on individual behavior or individual goodwill. And so that's where governments come in, helping to give very clear guidance about what's allowable. It makes it easier for people to make decisions when governments provide clear guidance about limiting the size of events, for example, about maintaining distance, and even having modified business openings, etc. So governments can help make this easier on all of their citizens by providing this clear guidance and continuing to do so. I think not giving false hope that this will disappear in the short term. It looks like we're in for the long haul. So the more governments can do to make that clear in their communication and to provide this clear guidance will make it easier for all of us.
Right. Professor Emily Smith, just wanting to go back to one of the main things you mentioned, test, trace, and track. The testing part of it, there is a lot of confidence that has been lost in terms of the tests as well. False negatives, false positives. What more do we know about the production of these tests, the standards that are trying to be met, and what can we say so far about their accuracy?
So I think we're in pretty good shape when it comes to diagnostic testing. This is also known as PCR testing, and this is to tell you if you have the disease right now. And so standards have gotten pretty good about this, and I have less concern about this. Around the world, there are a lot of tests, but we seem to be in pretty good shape when it comes to diagnostic testing. When it comes to antibody testing, which tells us if we had the disease previously, I think that's where there's still a lot of work to be done because we're still seeing a lot of new tests with varying degree of reliability.
Right. Now, trying to talk about a little more about CPT in Pakistan here, there is a lot of more optimism regarding it. There is it's being lauded as a solution, a miracle solution. Do you think that approach at this point in time is good, given that you mentioned that there don't seem to be any adverse impacts of this treatment?
It's not a miracle solution. For sure. Right now, we don't have a miracle solution when it comes to COVID-19. We have two promising things on the table that seem to treat people with severe disease. So mind you, convalescent plasma and the other recent drug shown to be effective is dexamethasone. These two drugs seem to be helpful among people who are already hospitalized and have severe disease. So these are already really sick people. And so that's a small fraction of the total burden of infection. And so it's not a miracle cure. It doesn't prevent COVID. It may help reduce the number of deaths or the number of people who require ventilation, for example, or it may shorten the disease for these hospitalized people. But that's just a small help. So yes, it's good news, but it is not a silver bullet. It is not a miracle cure.
Right. Now, these discrepancies that we're seeing all across the world in terms of how countries and communities are interpreting different, as we're calling it, treatments, let's not say solutions, but treatments. What do you think needs to be done more on the communication end of all of this, given how this isn't going to end anytime soon, and we do need coordination between countries and the WHO?
Yeah, so coordination is important to move more quickly. And in fact, we're seeing that with some of these trials. We're seeing people working together to get answers faster. And that's exciting news. And the second thing that coordination is needed is as we're discovering these new treatments, as vaccines become available, we need coordination for how we'll work together as a global community about, who gets the drugs, who gets the vaccines, and when, who gets the first doses, are they healthcare workers, how do we share them globally? And so that's something that's very important for all governments to engage in, because we don't know who and how and when these things will be discovered. And so that's really a point of focus right now that WHO is leading on.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Emily Smith, for joining us from Washington, D.C., taking out the time to talk to us. Now joining us is Dr. Tayyab Saeed Akhtar, who's a consultant medical specialist and chief medical officer at Shifa4U. He joins us from Lahore. Thank you so much, Dr. Akhtar, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, we've been talking about CPT, convalescent plasma therapy, and how it's being seen all across the world. But we see that in Pakistan, there seems to be greater optimism about it. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that there are so many people pushing for this treatment?
You're very right. Actually, it's all about how you convey your people about the true aspect of the story. Actually, as you know, and you would have been discussing it as well, that up till now there is no specific approved treatment for the COVID-19. And all the treatments that we're using are mainly, they are on experimental basis. And so is the convalescent treatment, the plasma treatment, and that is also one of the options that one can use. So actually the point is that this is how you convey the point to the audience that what is the real picture of the whole story. Actually, what happened that as we are dealing with this pandemic, and there is a lot of pressure on the healthcare workers, overall on the society, there is a psychological dilemma as well. So everyone is like after like if there is something, some option is out there, people start expecting a lot from it. And this is something that has been happening over here as well. One thing that we must understand is that, and we are emphasizing it for quite a long time and on different forums as well, that the good thing is that most of the people affecting with the COVID, they are actually, they get well. Like more than 80% of the patients get well without any treatment. Most of the patients don't even get the symptoms. So the point is that it doesn't mean that if you got a COVID positive result, you should start running for the plasma. It's not like this. Even if the FDA has approved this option as an experimental basis, it's only for some severely ill patients, not for everyone.
Right, Dr. Tayyab Akhtar, that's a very important point you make. So when we talk about this, that patients should not move towards treatments and therapies by themselves just because of, as you're saying, panic or self-diagnosis, what do you think are the ways in which we should regulate CPT?
Actually, as you know that it is yet an experimental thing, you know. So there are no specific guidelines. The things are still experimental. I must again say that the public is also be very clear on this, that this is an experimental therapy. It may work, it may not. We will come to know it after the results are out there in front of us. Although we have some good positive results in different infections in the past, like it's not a new thing. Like we know this therapy for the last 1 century. It's been used in Ebola as well.
Dr. Saeed Akhtar, I'm sorry to cut you off there. I just have a very short time left. Just in 30 seconds, if you have to say, what are the main things that the government should do when we're talking about CPT and it's still being experimental? What are the regulations that need to be imposed?
They must try to build the donor pool. They should they should urge them to build the pool so that for those selected patients who may get the benefit, must have an access to that particular pool in time, because to me the time is very important, because if the doctor has decided that this is the severely ill patient who is the candidate in which this trial drug should be given, so he should have an access quickly to the convalescent plasma. So for that the government has to build a good pool of the patients, and for that we have to encourage the recovered patients as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tayyab Akhtar, for joining us and talking to us. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we take a look at how far we've come in the race to find a vaccine. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, 7 months down in a world turned upside down by COVID-19, infecting more than 10.2 million people and claiming more than 500,000 lives. Where do we stand in developing a vaccine? Joining us today to discuss this is Dr. Amesh Adalja, who's a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins University. He deals with infectious diseases, pandemic preparedness, and biosecurity. He joins us from Pittsburgh. Thank you so much, Dr. Adalja, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, let's just dive right into it. Where are we standing in terms of moving towards finding a vaccine? How successful are we in that process of developing and accelerating the process?
We are moving very rapidly, but you have to remember we have to make enough vaccine to vaccinate the entire world. So that may take a period of maybe 2 years to be able to get enough people vaccinated to really see all the benefits from the vaccine. But I am hopeful that we will get a vaccine at some point.
The access of it, as you mentioned here, is a very, very important part of it. What are some of the things that governments need to keep in mind in terms of creating production lines and processes of distribution before even the vaccine is found? Are there things that governments can do to prepare for that?
Well, we have to work with partners in different countries that can help scale up manufacturing there. And we are seeing organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation doing that. So we likely will see some of the developing countries partner with some of the vaccine manufacturers to make the vaccine available. We want to get healthcare workers and high-risk individuals vaccinated around the world. That's the priority, because that's the way we move back to normal. It should not be the case that countries vaccinate their entire population before they allow export restrictions, because we know that there are different risks for different age groups, and we want to make sure that the high-risk individuals are the ones that are vaccinated first, along with healthcare workers around the world.
Right. Dr. Amesh Adalja, just one question to you before I let you go off. Now, there is this scenario of what if we don't develop a vaccine? In that worst case scenario, do you think we're preparing for a contingency plan?
I don't think that there's not a biological breakpoint that you can't get to a vaccine. I think we forget that we have vaccines for coronaviruses for cows and for avian species, and those are highly successful. So I think we will get a vaccine. But I think we have to be prepared that this doesn't deliver at the end of next year, or maybe need 2 years to actually make a vaccine, because vaccine development is something that is measured in years, not in months. The contingency would be to continue doing what we're doing, along with developing antibody-based treatment, convalescent plasma, other medications to decrease the in-hospital mortality of this. So we have other tools, but the vaccine would be the easiest way to remove this as a threat to the world.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Adalja, for your time and joining us from Pittsburgh, talking to us about this. You paint an optimistic picture that we indeed will hopefully get a vaccine, but the timeline there is not going to be any less than 2 years approximately. Now joining us for this discussion is Ms. Alaana Shaikh, who is a global health consultant. She joins us from Colombo. Thank you so much, Ms. Shaikh, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, as we talk about what needs to be done till we get to a vaccine, there's also a lot of groundwork. In 2019, the World Health Organization claimed that vaccine hesitancy is one of the greatest threats. That means trying to engage communities with how, when we do get a vaccine, everyone accepts it. What type of work do you think is needed for that?
So the issue of reluctance around vaccines has been a global problem, and we've seen things like the spread of measles, the spread of whooping cough, other completely preventable diseases. And that's because people don't necessarily understand that these diseases are still a threat, and they don't really understand, I believe, how a vaccine works or how it interacts with the body and why it's useful for them. So I think there's a lot of education to be done around, like, what's in a vaccine? How does it activate your immune system? People are very happy to build their immune systems with supplements or healthy foods, but somehow they're reluctant to build their immune systems with a vaccine. So we need to get people thinking about the need to use these items like vaccines to build their immune systems.
Right. And given that, Can you just expand a little more on that aspect? How much education and how that education can be given? Because we see this as a global problem. We're seeing the rise of anti-vaxxers, the strongest in places like the United States, across Europe, countries which overcame that problem of vaccine hesitancy, but now are again moving towards it. How do we educate and engage?
So there wasn't vaccine hesitancy when these diseases were still raging through people's lives and killing children all the time. When everybody knew somebody who died of measles, nobody hesitated for the measles vaccine. It's this comfort level that we've reached when we've actually got these diseases under control that makes people start to get nervous, I think. I think also there's a lot of deliberate misinformation being spread by different groups for different reasons. So I think there's a lot out there deliberately designed to confuse people. And so what we need to do is we need to think about what's making people hesitate. And what's making them hesitate is fears for the health of their children, that they're thinking about the future of their children, what's best for their children. And we need to make them recognize and give them the education and the tools they need to know that this vaccine is what's best for their children and for them. I mean, people who oppose vaccines are coming from a place of caring deeply about health. It's not that they don't care about health. It's that desire to preserve and protect health is ending up in a direction that actually harms it.
Right. Now, here's Ms. Alaana, Shaikh, and just talking about the idea of herd immunity. Can you tell us and shed a little more light on the difference between herd immunity, which can be developed naturally, and the one that is developed through the use of vaccinations? And in this case scenario, which seems to be the more possible and probable way to develop herd immunity?
So you develop herd immunity when there are enough people who are immune to a disease that even when someone gets sick, they can't really spread it because there's nobody vulnerable to spread it to. Now, there are different ways that you can become immune to a disease. One is with many diseases, if you have the disease and you get over it, you're immune afterwards. That is not true of all diseases, and we don't know yet if it's true of COVID. And then secondly, you can become immune to a disease by getting vaccinated for it. And we know that vaccination works because part of the testing process before they actually start using a vaccine is demonstrating that the vaccine makes you immune to the disease. So it's far more reliable in terms of inducing immunity in a person.
I asked this question specifically because we've seen all across the world, many countries, many governments say that natural herd immunity is the way to go. And since the spread of this disease is inevitable, there's no point in trying to, paralyze the entire economies or entire countries. Now, how do we move out of that very messy situation, especially for developing countries?
It is an enormous challenge, and I think everybody recognizes that. But the problem with thinking about herd immunity with COVID, there's a couple of problems. One of which is that even if you have COVID-19 and you recover, you can be severely disabled for the rest of your life. You can have heart damage, you can have lung damage or liver damage. Like you can never take a deep breath again because of COVID, even though you recovered. So one thing to think about is that being recovered from COVID is still damaging. There's no guarantee that surviving it means that your life goes back to the way it was. And then the second reason that you have to hesitate around herd immunity is, as I said, we don't know yet that surviving COVID makes you immune, or that if it does, how long that immunity might last.
Right. You're talking to me from Colombo, and of course, from this part of the world, there are a unique set of challenges, especially when it comes to the distribution of vaccines in itself. I put this question to our earlier guest. What type of groundwork do we need to create? What type of structures do we need to work on, anticipating that the vaccine will be found in a year or 2 years or 3 years, but the systems need to be in place?
Already have a robust system of vaccination around childhood vaccines, getting the vaccines to children. Community health workers, clinics, cold chain systems already set up. So the challenge is going to be thinking about vaccinating adults. how do we reach out to all the adults, and how do we get it in place? And I think you're probably going to want a multi-stage system as you slowly ramp up in how much vaccine you have access to, where you start with the people who are most vulnerable, most likely to either be infected with COVID, like healthcare workers, other frontline workers, and then people most likely to die of COVID, like people who are elderly or have chronic diseases or are immune compromised. So you're going to want to know sort of which populations need this vaccine as soon as it's available. You could also look at approaches like ring fencing, which is what they do with the Ebola vaccine, which is if they have an outbreak, they go in and vaccinate everybody in that community to keep the outbreak from spreading. So one thing you could look at with a limited supplies of a COVID vaccine was using it for ring fencing rather than trying to vaccinate the whole country. To do that, you have to have the data systems in place to track an outbreak. So that is groundwork that needs to be put in place.
Right. That is a very important point, and I'm going to end the show on that. Thank you so much, Ms. Alaana Shaikh, for joining us from Colombo. It is necessary to do the work that we can do before we get towards a vaccine. And as our guest said, it's important to create those sorts of systems of data accumulation. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.